Hey everyone, I'm here today with yet another history book review, this time moving to India for a captivating tale of war and plunder with consequences still resonating in India and also technically in the United Kingdom today. That book is The Anarchy by British historian William Dalrymple, and it's the story of how the British East India Company from the 1600s through the early 1800s came to take over the Indian subcontinent. The book was quite well received upon its publication in 2019. I know I heard about it myself a few months ago on an episode of The Ezra Klein Show, although I can't remember exactly which of his guests recommended it. So I went into this book with high hopes, even though I knew very little about the topic, and it's not really the first book I would have picked up if it hadn't been recommended. Dalrymple himself is of Scottish birth, although he's studied India extensively and lived there for many years. All of this obviously shapes his authorial viewpoint here, although for me is no reason to dismiss his historical study of India and the East India Company's role there. Here we learn of the establishment of the East India Company right around the year 1600, and how it rose from being a poorly organized, somewhat bumbling group of armed company traders seeking to profit from the spice and textile trades of one of the biggest economic powerhouses in the world, to expanding its control and eventually seizing control of the entire region. We learn about the declining Mughal Empire, a series of Muslim rulers that had governed the mostly Hindu peoples of the Indian subcontinent quite successfully for hundreds of years, but had by the mid-1600s begun to decline and to fragment regionally for reasons that are touched on, but mostly outside of the scope of this book. Still, Dalrymple's assertion and the basis of the book's title, The Anarchy, is this idea that the sort of weak power structures that existed in the formerly thriving region at the time created the perfect opportunity for the East India Company, loosely supported by the British Empire and by its distant shareholders, to come in and take root despite their initial logistical difficulties and ill-preparedness for the task. I'm going to admit right now that I'm not an expert on Indian history whatsoever. This is in fact my very first serious foray into the region's history, but I really enjoyed taking what the book gave me and following up on it with a bit of Wikipedia research and YouTube videos to understand what was going on. For curious readers like myself who really want to delve into the details of the history of the region, it provides plenty of little strings for us to pull on to unravel even more than what's given in the book. But one thing I appreciated was that for those of you who just want to appreciate this particular story and don't want to delve deeply into every single historical connection, the story remains accessible. And with an audiobook version coming in at about 15 hours, I found that this medium-length book generally sticks to the point, providing an interesting amount of detail, but not so much as to bore anyone who's not a historian or to completely lose the main thread. I liked the overall historical narrative of the book and found it worth reading for that alone. The story is full of corporate and political intrigue among and within the European powers, as well as between the local Indian powers of the time. We encounter plenty of interesting characters, some of them who seemed pretty despicable even to their contemporaries at the time, but others who form a more complicated picture upon reflection. Still, one shortcoming of this book is that it implies two major claims that may be true, but that I don't think are fully justified. The first is evident from the book's title itself, the importance of this so-called state of anarchy that existed in India at the time of the East India Company's arrival, and that allowed the company to take root and expand there. Although some historical details are laid out that could support such a claim, I didn't really think that the author did a great job of connecting the dots for us to show just how important it was. For example, the European colonists quickly took over the Americas in a way that in many ways seems remarkably similar, and a state of anarchy didn't really seem to be required there. There were plenty of native peoples that were well organized and arguably doing just as well as they had been for years. So then why was it so important to India that it forms the very title of this book? I would have appreciated a bit more commentary on how this situation of the British East India Company differs from others that seem, at least superficially, very similar. And I don't mean to say that there is certainly no difference, just that I don't think the author got his point across here, and because of that, I remain a bit skeptical. Another reason that the author argues the story of the East India Company is especially important, and the second major implication of the two I mentioned, is that it's a case where a corporation run by stockholders essentially became a geopolitical entity of its own, operating outside of the normal jurisdiction of its government. And again, this very well may be true, but I don't think the author did a good enough job of explaining why it's so noteworthy, and what implications this had for the local people that the company subjugated. I mean, yes, the British East India Company plundered the local region on a massive scale, in a way that was motivated by its immediate profits rather than by a long-term vision of wealth and prosperity for the people living in this region. But how does the East India Company-induced famine in India differ from, say, to use a more recent example that doesn't involve a corporation, the Soviet Union's grain requisitioning policies in Ukraine in the 1930s? If you've seen my review of Red Famine by Anne Applebaum, you'll know that this event, which came to be known as the Holodomor, led to widespread famine and the death of millions of ethnic Ukrainians, because it placed the needs and success of the Central Soviet territory of Russia above that of people deemed by the leadership to be both political opponents and lesser humans. Now, I know there are a lot of differences between these two cases, but my point is that a corporation isn't the only entity that's able to take over a formerly independent territory and place its own profits, using a loose definition of the word profit, above those of the conquered or subjugated peoples. What is common between both of these cases is that there came to be a huge power imbalance between the ruling country or corporation and those being ruled, and that to me seems more like the reason why in both cases the ruling party wasn't particularly accountable to those that it was subjugating. It's because for various reasons, neither the common Indian people in this book nor the rural Ukrainians in Red Famine really had much leverage to resist. They were just pawns in a game played by much larger powers. To be fair to Dalrymple, I'm not sure he's quite trying to go as far as to say that the fact that the East India Company was a corporation means that it had more reason or ability to subjugate the local peoples than in any other scenario. It is clear from his writing, though, that he sees something fundamental and important in the fact that this takeover was run by a corporate entity. And again, he may be right, but unfortunately I really can't speculate on what that thing is because it just didn't come across in this book. Still, despite lacking some of the broader contextualization that I think really would have made this book great, the book did work for me overall. I found it easy enough to digest, and that's true even though there were a lot of names in languages I was unfamiliar with. Everything being covered always felt interesting to me and relevant to the overall plot, so to speak, while also remaining firmly rooted in a historical narrative. And I appreciated that while there's plenty of controversy surrounding this period of history that reverberates even in today's geopolitics, the author's voice in telling the story remains mostly impartial. Certainly at times, especially at the beginning and the end, his views are clear, but for the most part he avoids casting the roles of heroes and villains. One could interpret this whole story simply as an early tale of corporate greed, of a wealthy and heartless group of investors out to make money and ready to devour everything in their path. And while there's definitely some truth to this reading, there's really a lot more to it than that. We encounter plenty of shady characters and decisions in this tale, even by some of the local Indian leaders. And maybe this is a statement in itself, that the true victims of the East India Company's looting of India were not always the local emperors, governors, and warlords, some of whom were weak or cruel leaders whose defeat felt more like poetic justice than oppression. Maybe the true victims were the normal people living in India at the time, and even to some extent those still living there today. The people who witnessed the power struggles and the instability of the repeated regime change as they struggled to fill their small roles in this changing political economy. But this book isn't first and foremost about the little people, so I'm just going to have to continue learning before I can say much more on that. Have you read The Anarchy or any other good English language books about Indian history that you'd recommend? I'm certainly open to reading more now about the Mughal Empire in particular. I know this forms just a tiny part of India's rich and multicultural history, but for me I hope this book is going to be a gateway into further learning about the region and its peoples. And if you want to hear more weekly reviews on history books and on a whole variety of other topics, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. Until next time, bye and happy reading.